You spend your whole life building something, not just a house, not just a bank account. I'm talking about a legacy, something that means something. A life built from hard work, long days, sore backs, and missed vacations. You sacrifice so much, not for praise or rewards, but for the people you love. For your family. In my case, that legacy took the shape of many things. The roof over our heads, the calluses on my hands, the lessons I tried to pass down. But if there was one symbol of it all, it was my old pickup truck. It wasn't fancy, wasn't fast, but it was mine. I'd driven that truck through snowstorms, job sites, family road trips. It was there for it all. A quiet witness to years of dedication. But then, one day I came home, and it was gone. Just like that. No note. No explanation. Just an empty driveway and a sinking feeling in my gut. Turns out my son, Ethan, had sold it, without asking, without a word. Thought it was just an old beater taking up space. He thought he was doing me a favor. But what he didn't realize is that he'd just thrown away something far more valuable than a few $100 from a used car sale. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to learn the most important lesson of his life. And I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to scream. No. I had something better in mind. He sold my beloved truck behind my back. But I got the last laugh. And when I did, he finally understood exactly what he had done. My name is Charles. I'm not a rich man, never have been. I've never had much use for credit cards, fancy clothes, or the latest gadgets. What I do have is earned, sometimes with a wrench in my hand, sometimes with sweat dripping from my brow, and always with pride. The kind of pride that doesn't come from titles or trophies, but from doing what needs to be done, even when no one's watching. I've spent the last 40 years working with my hands, fixing things, building things, showing up even. When I was dead tired, I didn't go to college, didn't travel the world. I built my life in a small town in a modest house with the kind of values that never go out of style: honesty, responsibility, and family. I raised my son, Ethan, with those same values, or at least I tried to. I taught him how to change a tire before he could legally drive, showed him how to patch a leaky pipe, how to look someone in the eye when shaking hands, and how to take pride in even the smallest job. But over time I started to notice something. The world was changing fast. People wanted everything quicker, quicker money, quicker results, quicker rewards. And somewhere in all that rush, the meaning behind the effort started to fade. That old truck of mine, it may have looked like a rust bucket to some, but to me it was a symbol of every mile I traveled to provide for my family. I bought that truck brand new back in the early 90s. It was the first and only vehicle I ever purchased off a dealership lot. I remember walking in with a savings envelope full of cash and walking out with the keys in my hand. I didn't have much back then, but that truck made me feel like I could conquer anything. It carried me to work every day without fail. Hauled lumber, tools, groceries, even a Christmas tree or two. I used to load it up with gear every Saturday morning when Ethan was a kid and take him to the lake or to the flea market with his mom. I still remember the sound of his laughter bouncing around the cab, the way he'd lean forward on the dashboard watching the road like it was a movie. Winters were tough where we lived, and that truck was a tank. There were mornings when the pipes were frozen and the driveway was slick with black ice, but the truck always started. Always. Even when I didn't feel like getting out of bed, when my back ached, or I'd caught the flu, it reminded me I had a job to do, and I showed up, for my boss, for my crew, for my family. It wasn't just transportation. That truck was part of the fabric of my life. The glove compartment held years of receipts, crumpled maps, and an old pocket knife my father gave me. The dashboard had a faint crack right where the sun hit it the hardest. But to me, that was just character. The bed of the truck had dents and scratches from 100 small projects and 2 decades of memories. I never cared about restoring it or making it look showroom new. It had earned its wear. To most folks, it was just rust and rubber. Outdated, replaceable. Even Ethan, who used to beg to ride shotgun, Started to look at it with a sort of dismissive grin once he hit his 20s. He had his eye on flashier cars, sleek, quiet, efficient. He once joked that my truck sounded like a dinosaur coughing. I laughed it off at the time. I figured he'd understand the value someday. But the thing is, that truck wasn't just a machine to me. It was my partner. Through the hardest winters and the longest days. Through job layoffs and new beginnings. Through the joy of bringing home Ethan as a newborn and the quiet, heart-wrenching drive home from the hospital after losing my wife. It was the one constant. Through every season of my life, that truck stood by me, reliable, unwavering. In a world full of change, that truck was one of the few things that reminded me who I was and why I kept going. I didn't need anyone else to see the value in it. I knew what it meant. And in a way, I thought Ethan did too. Or maybe I just hoped he did. Maybe I thought that all those lessons I tried to teach about loyalty, respect, and not judging things by how they look had sunk in. I wanted him to understand that worth isn't always about dollars and resale value. Sometimes, worth is about what something has carried you through. Sometimes it's about the stories it holds. But maybe I was wrong. Still, I never threw it in his face. I never gave long speeches about the good old days. I figured he'd learn in his own time. After all, life has a way of teaching us things we don't always want to hear. And I had faith that one day he'd see the truck, not just as an old hunk of metal, but as a part of our story. A piece of the legacy I'd been quietly building for years. I kept it parked in the driveway, cleaned it every few weeks, gave it regular tune-ups. Not because it was perfect, but because it deserved to be cared for. It deserved respect. And even if no one else saw its value, I did. Because that truck didn't just carry tools or groceries. It carried me through decades of hard work, loss, growth, and love. Through the kind of life that doesn't make headlines but makes a difference. And I wasn't about to let it go. Ethan had always been a good kid. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. He was smart, respectful, curious. I raised him to be that way. I took pride in the way he carried himself, especially as a boy. But something shifted after he moved into adulthood. College opened his eyes to a world beyond our small town, and suddenly, everything around here seemed old-fashioned to him. The house, the routine, the way I talked about work, even the truck, especially the truck. He'd roll his eyes every time it needed a jump or if it sputtered in the cold. He didn't see a lifetime of stories in that cab like I did. He saw inconvenience. He saw age. He saw something that didn't belong in the image he was building for his life. I thought it was just a phase. I thought he'd outgrow the attitude and come to understand the weight of what I'd been trying to give him. Not material things, but a foundation, a heritage. Turns out I overestimated him. It was a Thursday. I remember because I had taken the day off work to fix a broken fence post in the backyard. I had the post hole digger ready, the concrete mix, everything laid out. I walked through the front yard to grab something from the truck and it wasn't there. At first I thought I was mistaken. Maybe I'd parked it around the side. Maybe I'd loaned it to someone. My mind ran through every possible explanation, except the one that turned out to be true. I went back inside, a little confused, maybe even a little worried. I called, "Ethan." No answer. I tried again, straight to voicemail. Hours passed. I kept checking the driveway like it was going to magically reappear. Like maybe this was all just some stupid misunderstanding. But deep down, I felt it. That gnawing in my gut that told me something wasn't right. Ethan didn't come home until late that night. When he finally walked through the door, he looked a little too casual. I didn't even get a greeting before he said it. "Hey, Dad, I got rid of the truck." Just like that. I stood frozen. He said it like he'd taken out the trash or recycled an old appliance. My voice caught in my throat. "You did what?" I asked. Slow, careful, like maybe I'd misheard him. He waved his hand like it was no big deal. "I sold it to a dealership out near the highway. Figured we could use the extra cash. And let's be honest, that thing was falling apart." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No conversation. No permission. No thought for what it might mean to me. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just looked at him, and something inside me sank like a stone. That truck wasn't his to sell. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was mine. It was a piece of me, a piece of my life. He didn't just take something physical, he took something sacred. And the worst part? He didn't even realize it. That night I sat alone on the porch, staring at the empty driveway. I thought about all the years I'd spent teaching him the value of hard work, of respect, of earning your way. Had it all gone in one ear and out the other? I raised him better than this. Or at least I thought I had. The more I sat with it, the more it hurt. Not just what he did, but how lightly he did it. As if my connection to that truck and everything it represented was just some old man's attachment to junk. He didn't understand that every scratch on that fender had a story, that the worn-out seat had carried me home after 16-hour shifts, that the creak in the door had been there since the night his mother and I took our last drive together. He saw it as disposable, and by selling it, it felt like he saw me as disposable too. It wasn't just the act, it was the betrayal. It was the complete disregard for something that mattered deeply to me. Something I assumed he understood at least a little. But in that moment, I realized something painful. Ethan had stopped seeing me as a person. I was just Dad, a background character in the movie of his life, someone who existed to help, to fund, to provide, but not someone with a story or attachments or feelings that deserved consideration. That realization hit me harder than I can describe. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was about the respect that had quietly eroded between us, and I hadn't even noticed until it was gone. Still, I didn't lash out. I didn't demand he fix it. I didn't throw my disappointment in his face, because deep down I knew yelling wouldn't teach him anything. If I wanted him to really understand, I had to do something different, something quieter, stronger. I had to show him, not just tell him what that truck meant, and by extension, what I meant. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I didn't even know if the truck was still sitting on the lot, or if someone else had already taken it. But I made a decision that night, sitting under that porch light in silence. I would find that truck. I would bring it back. And when I did, I wouldn't rub it in Ethan's face. I wouldn't say a word until he asked. This wasn't about revenge, it was about reminding him of something deeper, about teaching him a lesson he couldn't find in a textbook or a podcast, a lesson about value, about memory, about the weight of someone else's history. He might not have seen it yet, but he was standing at a crossroads in his life, and I had one last chance to steer him toward the path of respect before it was too late. I just hoped he'd recognize it when the time came, because some things, once lost, can't be bought back. But this time, I intended to try. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, oblivious or maybe just indifferent, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring into a cold cup of coffee. The house was quiet, but inside my head, it wasn't. My thoughts kept circling the same bitter loop. He sold the truck. He sold it without even asking, like it meant nothing. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a careless mistake. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years, unnoticed under the surface. Somewhere between report cards and graduation photos, between summer breaks and job interviews, the boy I raised had grown into a man I didn't quite recognize. And maybe, just maybe, that was my fault too. I had worked so hard to provide for him, to protect him, to make sure he never had to struggle the way I did, that I hadn't seen what I might be robbing him of. The lessons in gratitude, in humility, in respect for things that don't come easy. Somewhere along the way, I think he started to believe everything just showed up, that things had no weight unless they had a price tag, that the past was something to be discarded the moment it stopped being useful. The truck wasn't just a trigger, it was a mirror. It reflected everything I'd been holding in for years. It made me realize how much distance had grown between me and my son, even though we lived under the same roof. I thought back to when he was little, how he used to beg me to honk the horn just to hear the deep echoing sound, how he'd fall asleep in the passenger seat after a long day out. Back then, the truck wasn't old. It was cool. It was Dad's. Somewhere along the way, that changed. It became embarrassing, outdated, not worth fixing. I remembered the time he asked me why I didn't just trade it in and finance something newer. I told him because this one still works, and it's paid for. He didn't say much after that, but I could see it in his eyes. He didn't understand. Or worse, he didn't care. And now? He'd gone and sold it behind my back. No discussion, no heads up. Just a casual admission after the fact, like it was nothing more than an old couch he'd listed online. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I found myself walking out to the driveway around 2 a.m., barefoot, arms crossed against the cold. The empty space where the truck used to sit hit me like a gut punch. You know how people talk about phantom pain? When you lose a limb and still feel it? That's what it was like. I could see it there, plain as day. I could hear the way. The door creaked when it opened. I could smell the oil, the leather, the trace of sawdust that always seemed to linger no matter how many times I cleaned it. It wasn't just gone. It was stolen. Not by a stranger, but by my own flesh and blood. And yet, even through the hurt, I found myself wondering what was going through Ethan's head. Did he really think he was doing me a favor? Was he trying to help? Did he believe that I would somehow thank him for lightening my burden? Or did he just not care? That question kept me awake more than anything else, because if it was carelessness, that I could eventually forgive. But if it was coldness, if it was rooted in disrespect, that was harder to swallow. I wanted to believe he meant well, that he'd gotten it wrong, but that his heart was still good, that maybe he thought I was too sentimental, or maybe he saw me slowing down, struggling more than I let on, and thought the truck was a symbol of that struggle. But the truth was, he never asked, never gave me a chance to explain why I kept it, why it mattered, what it represented. And that stung, because I had given him everything, my time, my money, my guidance. I never missed a parent-teacher night, never let him go to bed without dinner, worked overtime more times than I could count just so he could have the shoes he wanted, the phone he asked for, the chance to apply to that out-of-state university. And still, he couldn't even give me the courtesy of a conversation before taking something that meant the world to me. I started to think maybe I'd failed. Maybe I'd done too much for him. Maybe, in protecting him from the world's hardness, I'd softened him too much. I'd made things too easy. I never made him fix anything when it broke. I just fixed it for him. I never let him ride out the consequences of a mistake. I bailed him out. I called teachers. I negotiated with bosses. I made excuses. And now, looking back, I saw the pattern so clearly. I had built a life where Ethan didn't have to understand cost. Not just financial cost, but emotional, personal, historical cost. Everything came easy, so nothing carried weight. So the truck? That was just collateral damage in a much bigger issue. And I realized, sitting there in the dark with my back against the porch post, that I had to do something about it. Not just to get the truck back, but to reach him. To open his eyes. I couldn't keep letting this go. Not for my sake, but for his. If I didn't make this right now, then someday he'd treat something, or someone, else the same careless way. And I couldn't let that happen. I pulled out my phone and started searching local listings, dealerships, used lots, private sellers. I didn't even know the exact name of the place he'd taken it to, but I was determined. If the truck was still out there, I would find it. And if I did, I wouldn't just bring it back, I'd restore it. I'd make it shine like it hadn't in years. Not for me, not to hold on to the past. But to remind my son that some things aren't replaceable. It took me 3 days of calling around before I found it. A small used dealership out on the edge of town. One of those places with more dust than customers and a plastic banner flapping in the wind like it had given up trying to attract anyone. When I asked if they had a dark blue '93 Chevy pickup recently traded in, the man on the phone chuckled. "Oh yeah," he said. Didn't think anyone would be asking about that one. Been sitting here since Tuesday. Engine still runs, but she's rough. My heart sank a little at the word rough, but I asked him to hold it anyway. He seemed surprised. You sure? Not much left in her. I didn't bother explaining. I just said, yeah, I'm sure. The next morning I drove over in my wife's old sedan and parked at the edge of the lot. There it was, my truck, sitting off to the side like a stray dog nobody wanted. It looked worse than I remembered. A layer of dust coated the windows. The tires were underinflated and there was a bright orange clearance tag slapped on the windshield like an insult. I walked up to it slowly, the way you approach a grave. My hand touched the door handle and something cracked inside me. Not anger, not even sadness. Just this deep, quiet ache, like something sacred had been violated but still somehow was standing. I opened the door and climbed in. The seat creaked. The smell hit me like a memory. Old leather, faint traces of motor oil, and the unmistakable scent of home. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, fingers tracing the same grooves they had, for decades. And that's when I knew I wasn't just going to buy the truck back, I was going to bring it back to life. The man at the lot gave me a price that was frankly too high for a vehicle in that condition. I didn't argue. I didn't care. I handed over the money I'd been saving, the small stash of bills I'd been quietly putting aside over the past few months for emergencies. And in a strange way, this was an emergency. Not for survival, but for meaning, for memory, for dignity. I drove the truck home slow, careful, every noise under the hood echoing like an old friend calling out after a long silence. Ethan wasn't home when I pulled into the driveway. That was good. I didn't want him to see it yet. Not like this. Over the next few days, I got to work. I spent early mornings and late evenings polishing the chrome, patching the paint, and changing out parts that hadn't worked right in years. I went to scrapyards, parts stores, even found a few rare pieces online. I talked to mechanics, watched tutorials, used tools I hadn't touched in years. There was something meditative about it. Each bolt, each shine of the buffer, felt like I was repairing more than just a truck. I was restoring something inside myself too. And every night, as I wiped the grease from my hands and looked at the truck sitting there just a little shinier, a little stronger than the day before, I thought about Ethan, not with anger but with a quiet, stubborn kind of love. I didn't want to punish him. I wanted to wake him up. I wanted him to see what he'd missed, what he'd dismissed, what he'd sold away without a second thought. By the end of the second week, the truck looked like a time machine. Not perfect, not factory fresh, but full of pride again. It gleamed, under the afternoon sun, standing tall like it had been waiting for someone to remember its worth. That evening, Ethan came home. He parked his sleek little car behind the house like he always did, headphones in, staring down at his phone. I watched from the garage as he made his way toward the front door. He didn't even glance toward the driveway at first. It wasn't until he reached the steps that something caught his eye. He froze, turned slowly. And there it was, the look on his face, confusion, recognition, disbelief. He took a few steps closer, then a few more, until he was standing right next to it. He reached out, almost cautiously, and touched the freshly polished hood. Then he turned to me. Dad, is that... His voice trailed off. I nodded, wiping my hands on a rag. Yeah, it's her. I bought her back. He looked like he didn't know what to say. His mouth opened, closed again. His eyebrows knit together, and for a moment, he looked like a kid again. Lost. Vulnerable. But why? I set the rag down and leaned against the workbench. Because, son, some things you don't sell. Some things aren't about money or convenience. They're about where you come from, about who you are. You didn't just sell a truck, you sold years of work, memories, family history. You sold something you didn't understand and didn't care to ask about. He stood there, shoulders slumping, the weight of what he'd done finally sinking in. I thought it didn't matter, he said quietly. I thought you kept it around just because you didn't want to admit it was time to let it go. I nodded slowly. Yeah, that's exactly what you thought. But maybe next time, before you decide what's worth keeping and what's not, you'll ask. Maybe you'll take a minute to think about what something means to someone else. He didn't say anything for a long time, but when he did, his voice cracked just a little. I'm sorry, Dad. I really didn't get it, but I do now. And in that moment, something shifted, not just between us, but within him. The lesson had landed, not through shouting or punishment, but through quiet determination, through showing, not telling, through a truck that refused to be forgotten. The silence between us after Ethan's apology was heavy, not awkward, not tense, but meaningful. He stood there with his hand still resting on the truck's hood, eyes lowered, shoulders rounded in a posture I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, getting caught sneaking in after curfew. But this time, the guilt wasn't because he broke a rule, it was because he broke trust. And that realization, I could see, was finally sinking in. He didn't speak for a long moment, just let the stillness wrap around us while the late afternoon sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the driveway. There was something different in his face now, not just regret, but recognition, a kind of awakening, like he was seeing the world through a new lens. Or maybe for the first time, he was really seeing me. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. I think I always knew it mattered to you. I just didn't think it mattered this much. He let out a breath like he'd been holding it for days. And that scares me because I didn't even ask. I didn't even consider what it meant to you. I nodded slowly, keeping my arms crossed, not out of anger, but to hold in the emotion swelling in my chest. That's what bothered me the most, Ethan. Not the money, not even the truck, but that you looked at something important to me and decided for yourself that it didn't have value, that your opinion was the only one that counted. He looked down again, visibly struggling with the weight of those words. I've been so focused on moving forward, on growing up, being independent, that I forgot where I came from. He gestured toward the truck. This is where I came from. You. And this truck. And everything you built around it. I just didn't want to be the guy with the old truck. You know? That hit me. Not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. And in that moment I realized this wasn't just about disrespect, it was about distance. Ethan had been trying to build his identity, trying to step out from the shadow of everything I'd built. And in doing so, he'd severed himself from the roots that had made him strong in the first place. And how could I blame him entirely for that, when I'd spent so many years quietly shouldering everything, rarely explaining the why behind what I did? Maybe that was part of the problem too. I never told him the story of how I bought the truck with the last bit of savings your mother and I had before she got sick. I never explained how that truck had once been our shelter when we couldn't pay rent for a month and slept in it at a rest stop, wrapped in coats, pretending it was a road trip. I never shared how, after your mother passed, I sat in that driver's seat for 3 hours because I couldn't walk into the house without hearing her laughter. I just kept those stories locked up thinking they were too heavy for a kid. But maybe, just maybe, I should have let him carry a little of that weight sooner. I took a deep breath and said, You want to know why I kept it? Why I couldn't let it go? He looked at me, eyes open, ready now. Yeah, I really do. So I told him. I told him everything. About the nights I drove home so tired I forgot where I was. About the morning he was born and how I rushed your mother to the hospital in that truck, praying we'd make it in time. About the camping trips, the scraped knees, the fishing poles. About the sacrifices, the struggles, the victories, all of them marked in one way or another by that truck's presence. I told him how when he left for college I'd sit in it sometimes with the engine off and just listen to the quiet, pretending for a few minutes that things hadn't changed. That the house wasn't too quiet, that the porch light still needed to be left on. And he listened, really listened. No phone in hand, no distractions. Just his eyes wide and glassy, locked on mine as if he was watching a reel of our family's past unfold right in front of him. Every story I told seemed to chip away at the version of me he'd boxed up in his mind. Just Dad, the guy who paid the bills, mowed the lawn, and drove the same old truck forever. He began to understand that I wasn't just a fixture in his life. I was a man who had lived, who had hurt, who had loved, and who had chosen to hold on to the things that mattered. That night, we didn't go inside for hours. We just stood around the truck talking. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a father lecturing his son. It felt like two men finding common ground, not in what was said, but in what was understood. The gap between us closed not with a single sentence, but with every shared story, every honest word, every look of acknowledgement. Then he said something I'll never forget. Dad, I think I finally get it. You weren't holding onto the truck because you were stuck in the past. You were holding onto it because it reminded you of who you are, of where we came from. And I'm really sorry I tried to take that from you. And that was the turning point. Not just for the story, but for us. He realized the value wasn't in the metal or the mileage. It was in the memory, the connection, the silent history embedded in that old bench seat and weathered steering wheel. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to start sharing more of those memories before they disappeared with me. The truck had brought us full circle. What he saw as a burden had become a bridge. What he thought he had taken away ended up giving us something far more valuable. A new understanding. And for the first time in a long while, I looked at my son and thought, not just, he's learning, but he's growing. Right there, under a fading sky and beside a restored old truck, something far more important had been restored between us two. The days that followed were different, quiet, but not in the uncomfortable way they had been before. It was a calmness that settled between us, a kind of peace neither of us had known for a long time. But there was still something hanging in the air, unspoken, unfinished. Ethan had heard my stories. He had seen the truck restored to life. He had apologized. But I knew that understanding something and changing because of it were two different things. The real test, the moment that would show me if that realization had truly taken root, was still ahead. And strangely enough, I wasn't looking for grand gestures. I wasn't expecting him to break down in tears or write me a letter. I just wanted to see if he'd step forward on his own, not out of guilt, but out of respect. If he'd take ownership, not just for what he did, but for what he'd learned. Because saying sorry is easy, but living like you mean it? That's a whole different story. A few days later, I came home from running errands to find something I never expected. The truck was in the driveway, nothing unusual there, but the hood was popped and Ethan was under it. Tools laid out on the ground like I used to do. A tarp spread under his knees, sweat dripping from his brow. No music playing, no phone in sight. Just him and the engine, focused. I stood there for a moment, watching him work, half amazed, half suspicious. I walked over slowly and asked, "Everything all right?" He looked up, startled but smiling. "Yeah, just figured I'd change out the air filter. I remember you saying it always ran better when it was fresh." I blinked. Not because of what he said, but how he said it. Like it mattered. Like he wanted the truck to run well. Not just for me, but because he understood that it deserved that kind of care. I crouched beside him and watched as he tightened the bolts carefully, checking his work twice. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable. Like two old friends working side by side. When he was finished, he closed the hood gently, not with the usual slam he'd always used in the past. Then he turned to me and said something that hit me right in the chest. I was thinking, maybe I could take her out for a drive sometime, just to feel what it's like. I never really appreciated it before. I studied his face. There was no smugness, no performative apology, just sincerity. I gave a small nod. She'd like that. And so he did. That Saturday, he took the truck out on a quiet back road route I used to drive when I wanted to clear my head. When he came back, A couple hours later, there was a grin on his face I hadn't seen since he was a kid. "She's a beast," he said, laughing. "But I get it now. She's not fast. Not smooth, but she's solid. She feels like something real." I chuckled and patted the hood. "That's because she is." That drive became the start of something new between us. A shift in rhythm. We weren't just coexisting anymore. We were connecting. Ethan started asking more questions about my life. Real questions, not just surface-level stuff. He wanted to know more about his grandfather, about the house I grew up in, about how I met his mother. And in turn, he started telling me more about his world, his fears about not living up to expectations, his uncertainty about where his life was going, his guilt over how he'd treated things, treated me. And for the first time in years, I stopped talking like a father giving advice and started listening like a man speaking to his equal. But the real climax came one evening, about a week after that first drive. Ethan knocked on the garage door while I was organizing a toolbox. He held something in his hand, a small square object wrapped in brown paper. "I got you something," he said, handing it to me. "It's nothing big, just something I wanted you to have." I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a black leather key case. Simple, worn-looking, like something that belonged in a glove box from the 90s. But it wasn't just any key case. It was engraved. Inside, in small gold letters, were the words, "For every mile you carried." I didn't say anything for a long time, just ran my fingers over the letters. My throat tightened. Ethan looked nervous. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know. I'm proud to be part of that story, even if I didn't get it before." That was it. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. The turning point wasn't just that he had listened. It was that he had understood. And not just in his mind, but in his heart. He saw me, not just as the man who raised him, but as the man who lived before him, who built something out of nothing, who kept driving, even when the road was long and the weight was heavy. And now, for the first time in his life, he was ready to carry part of that weight too. After I closed the key case and slipped it gently into my shirt pocket, I looked at Ethan for a long time. Not to make him uncomfortable, not to make the moment dramatic, but because I needed him to see something in my eyes. The weight of pride, forgiveness, and yes, a bit of sadness too. Sadness for the time lost, for the years where we spoke past each other instead of to each other. But in that moment, I saw something that replaced the sadness. Hope. Ethan stood in front of me, not as the boy who once dismissed everything I stood for, but as a man who had started to understand where he came from and why it mattered. I clapped, a hand on his shoulder, firm but gentle, and said, "You know, I wasn't sure I'd ever get through to you, not really. I figured you'd learn one day, but not because of anything I said or did, just because life would eventually teach you the hard way." I gave a small laugh, the kind that comes from years of earned wisdom. But maybe this was life teaching you, and maybe I just got to be part of it after all. Ethan nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah, I think this was the lesson I didn't know I needed." We stood in the garage for a few more minutes, the quiet hum of the overhead light buzzing above us, the scent of motor oil, old tools, and warm summer air filling the space. Then, for the first time in his life, he said the words, "Every father silently hopes to hear, though we never ask for them. I'm proud of you, Dad, not just for the truck, for everything, for who you are." That moment landed heavier than anything he could have bought, fixed, or written. It was the real restoration. Not of the truck, but of us. From that point on, things shifted between us in small but powerful ways. He started spending more time around the house, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to help, sometimes to sit quietly and watch a ball game with me like we used to when he was young. He even started taking the truck out on Sundays, slow drives, with no destination, just to feel the road, to listen to the engine, to remind himself where he came from. And I noticed something else too. The truck started to look different, Not just because I had cleaned it up, but because he now treated it differently. He parked it with care. He wiped the dust off the dashboard without being asked. He didn't rush in and slam the doors anymore. He respected it, just like he was learning to respect me. Not because I demanded it, but because he finally saw the story behind the steel dot. It wasn't long before he came to me with another idea. What if we did a full restoration together? He asked one afternoon, flipping through a parts catalog. Like, not just touch-ups, but the whole thing, a rebuild. You teach me. I learn from you. We do it side by side. I smiled. Not a wide grin. Just a knowing one. The kind you get when you see your effort finally come full circle. That sounds like a hell of a plan. So we started. Slowly. Piece by piece. Greasy hands. Late nights. Missed bolts and shared laughter. It wasn't about the truck anymore. It was about the bond. The rebuilding of something that had quietly broken between us, now being reforged one lug nut at a time. And in those quiet hours in the garage, the unspoken truths between us found space to breathe. He asked about his mother more, asked what I went through after she passed, asked about the times I struggled to hold everything together while still trying to keep life looking normal for him. And I told him, honestly, openly, not to make him feel guilty, but to give him something I should have given him long ago. The full story. Because sometimes our children don't need protection. They need perspective. And Ethan, for the first time, was ready to receive it. That summer became the most meaningful season of my life. Not because we rebuilt a truck, but because I got to rebuild something far more precious, the relationship with my son. And it all started because of a mistake that hurt, a mistake that could have ended in silence and resentment. But instead, it ended in understanding. Looking back, I realize now that getting the last laugh didn't mean revenge or proving him wrong. It meant showing him the value of something he couldn't see before, and then watching him choose to see it, choose to honor it, choose to carry it forward. And as we stood one evening in the fading light staring at the truck we'd rebuilt together, Ethan turned to me and said, "One day, I'll pass this down to my son, and I'll make sure he knows the stories. I won't let him forget." And that was all the validation I ever needed. Life doesn't give you many second chances, not with the things that matter most. You can buy another car, get a new job, build a new house, but time, respect, connection with the people you love, once those things are gone, they're hard, sometimes impossible to get back. And for a while, I thought I had lost that with Ethan. Not because of the truck. Not really. That was just the trigger. What hurt more was the feeling that somewhere along the road he had stopped seeing me. That I had become a fixture in the background of his life, rather than the man who built the foundation he now stood on. But that's the funny thing about stories. They can get buried, forgotten, or misunderstood, until something brings them back to the surface. For us, it took a betrayal, an old truck, and a lesson taught not with anger, but with action. In the weeks and months that followed our turning point, everything felt different, but not in a dramatic movie ending kind of way. No grand speeches, no perfect father-son moments under a glowing sunset. It was quieter than that, more real. The kind of change that comes in small shifts, like the way Ethan started calling just to check in, or how he'd show up unannounced on weekends to work on the truck or share dinner. He began listening more, asking better questions, and more importantly, remembering the answers. He'd repeat things I'd told him weeks before, reference stories I never thought he paid attention to. That's when I knew. He wasn't just hearing me now. He was seeing me, as a man, as a father, as someone whose life didn't begin and end with paying bills or fixing things. One day we were out back working on the engine, fine-tuning a few things before a small local car show. Ethan was wiping down a panel when he asked, "Do you think you would have handled it the same way if I hadn't learned the lesson?" I looked at him, surprised by the honesty of the question. I paused before answering because it deserved more than a quick reply. "I don't know," I said. I think I had to try. Whether you learned from it or not, I had to stand up for what mattered. Not because I wanted to win, but because I couldn't let it slide. Not just for me, but for you too. He nodded, letting the words sink in. That's when I realized that what I had done, buying the truck back, restoring it, letting him see it with new eyes, wasn't just about getting the last laugh. It was about leaving behind a different kind of legacy. One built not on silence or control, but on truth. C, people think legacy is about money, about names etched on plaques or passed down businesses. But real legacy? It's in the values we carry, the ones we live by, the ones we protect even when no one else understands. That truck represented more than nostalgia. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of hard-earned lessons, of memories that built the bones of our family. And now, it's also a symbol of something new, forgiveness, growth. A second chance taken, not wasted. The day of the car show came, and we drove the truck together, father and son. We didn't enter it to win anything. We knew it wasn't the flashiest or most pristine vehicle there, but that wasn't the point. As we pulled into the lot and parked alongside rows of polished chrome and candy-colored paint jobs, a few folks wandered over. One guy nodded and said, "She's got soul." And Ethan smiled wide and replied, "Yeah, she really does." It wasn't just pride I saw in his eyes that day. It was reverence. And it wasn't for the truck alone. It was for everything. It had come to represent. Later that night after the show, we sat on the porch, same spot I had sat alone the night he sold the truck, feeling gutted and invisible. Except now I wasn't alone. Ethan sat next to me, arms resting on his knees, both of us watching the sun dip below the trees. The air was quiet, peaceful, and in that silence, he said something simple. "Thanks for not giving up on me." I didn't reply right away. I didn't need to. I just looked at him, nodded once, and put a hand on his shoulder. Because the truth is, I hadn't given up on him. Even in the worst moment, even when I felt the most hurt, I knew there had to be a way back. I knew the man I'd raised was still in there somewhere, buried under pride or distraction or just plain immaturity. And I knew that if I stayed silent, if I just let it go, he'd never have the chance to grow from it. So I chose to act, not out of spite, not to punish, but to teach. And sometimes teaching doesn't look like lectures or shouting. Sometimes it looks like patience. It looks like doing the hard thing quietly. So the lesson speaks for itself. Now, when I see Ethan behind the wheel of that truck, when I see how he takes care of it, how he tells the story to his friends, how he speaks about me with pride, I realize that the lesson stuck. And more than that, it changed him. Maybe not overnight. Maybe not in the way I imagined. But it happened. And that's all I ever really wanted. Not for him to be perfect, but for him to understand, to grow, to become better. And maybe one day when he's older, when he has a son of his own who questions the value of something worn, something old, something he doesn't yet understand, he'll remember all this. And instead of getting angry, he'll tell the story, he'll pass it down. Not just the truck, but the lesson, the legacy, the quiet strength of standing your ground without burning a bridge. So if you ask me what I got out of all this, if I got revenge or satisfaction or justice, I'd tell you no. What I got was better. I got my son back. And that was worth everything. If this story resonated with you even just a little, take a moment to think about the people and things in your life that carry more meaning than they show on the surface. Maybe it's a piece of furniture handed down from your grandparents. Maybe it's an old watch, a handwritten letter, or even just a quiet family tradition that's been around for generations. These aren't just things. They're pieces of a story. Pieces of you. And sometimes it takes losing, or almost losing, those pieces to realize just how much they matter. So, let me ask you, have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated the value of something you held dear? Maybe they didn't understand its meaning. Maybe they gave it away, dismissed it, or walked away from it. If so, How did you handle it? And what did it teach you about yourself or them? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. This channel is built on real moments. Stories that may not make headlines but that make us feel, think, and connect. If this one made you pause, smile, or reflect, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you want more stories like this, ones rooted in truth, emotion, and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications. We've got more to share. Because sometimes, the quietest moments leave the loudest echoes. And sometimes, the lessons we never expected are the ones we remember forever.